Every patch, practically without fail, we as a player base will receive survey results from Lucky Bancho, which provides information on the rising and falling active player counts, as well as interaction rates for newly released pieces of content. Now that we're reaching the end of Dawntrail, which I think it's fair to say has been a somewhat controversial expansion in terms of player counts, and as a result, during it, we've seen all kinds of peaks and valleys after the relatively consistent growth of the end of the Hydaelyn and Zodiark saga. To me, the question that stands is whether the Evercold announcement and the recent hype cycle that followed it did enough to bring people back into the fold who may have fallen out of love with Square Enix's MMORPG for whatever reason. I always find these things really interesting, and whilst a lot of people love to use these as a way to either doom and gloom about the game or to argue it should be utterly immune to criticism, I find it quite interesting to see the trends that you can clearly track and when any strange outliers occur. Before we take a proper look at it, I have to do a bit of housekeeping and make a disclaimer. This is a fan-made census and it is not official in any way, and because of that the numbers won't be 100% entirely accurate. It's generally put together based on player achievement data, which is public, and because of privacy settings and some back-end weirdness that happens occasionally, you are going to run into cases where a small percentage of people are not properly tracked. Statistics will usually be projections at first before they're fully confirmed a little later down the road too, which actually happened here and will be something I'll talk about, so the numbers might shift a tad over time. Either way, it's the best we've got, and it provides a mostly accurate picture of what's going on with the game right now. So here's the latest Lucky Bancho Census with information up to date for July 20th, 2026. As always, you can pore over the exact figures if you want, but for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to round things up to the nearest 10,000. Right now, we're looking at an active global player count of around 960,000 characters. Active characters are defined as characters whose most recently updated gear set includes item levels above or equal to 700, or where experience points have changed since the previous survey a couple of months ago. So that is either players that have reached endgame, or players that have made progress in the last few months. Compared to the previous census, that is an increase of roughly 30,000 active players, taking us from around 930k to 960k worldwide. It's not an enormous jump, especially compared to the resurgence we saw around patch 7.4, but it is a healthy sign that the game has managed to begin to surge as players are anticipating Evercold. This was expected, honestly, and it feels like community discussion and outlook has taken a bit of a tonal shift in a positive direction. One thing to note here, because I think you may be expecting larger numbers than that and a larger shift, Shadowbringers has joined the Final Fantasy XIV free trial recently, and as a result, you might have heard early reports of active player counts soaring past 1 million. That's because this shift hadn't been accounted for in the initial Lucky Bancho numbers, though it has been corrected now, and that's why it sits around 960k. So if you are counting all of the players that are now moving through Shadowbringers on their free trial, it is past 1 million at that point, but those players are not being counted. What's perhaps even more interesting is where those gains come from. North America grew by about 20k, pushing it comfortably beyond 450,000 active characters. OCE remains relatively stable at around 14,000 active players. Just like last time, the western regions continue to account for the majority of the growth, and also it's important to note that just like last time, we are not getting numbers from the Chinese and Korean data centers, which now are up to parity with the current global release schedule and will likely house a large number of players all on their own. That's becoming less of a one-off occurrence and more of a genuine trend throughout the tail end of Dawntrail, to make it clear, that being the western regions continuing to account for a lot of the growth. You see far larger swings in player rises and player fallings in the West than you do in Japan, at least fairly consistently throughout Dawntrail. It would be easy to speculate about differing player habits between Japanese and Western audiences, particularly around patch cadence and the willingness to return for specific pieces of content, and also how much it takes for them to unsubscribe in the first place, but without Square Enix's internal data, it's really kind of hard to say for sure. What we can say with confidence is that Western data centers continue to be reclaiming characters strongly since Evercold was announced at the North American Fan Festival. Globally, we're now sitting at around 285,000 returning players. North America alone accounts for over 150k of those returners, with Japan sitting just under 70k and Europe just over 60k. That's a substantial increase and arguably the standout statistic from the entire census. It suggests the latest patch and the promotional campaign for Evercold has been very successful at convincing former players to log back in. If you're somebody excited for the future of FF14 and hope to see another renaissance for it in terms of popularity, this is a good sign, providing the positive press continues onwards into next expansion. The number of brand new characters also continues to grow. The census recorded around 55,000 new characters, essentially flat compared to the roughly 60k we saw previously. That suggests the influx of genuinely new players remains fairly healthy, which I think is a good thing. One statistic I always like looking at is the number of players who have reached the current level cap. Around 720,000 characters have reached level 100 out of those active players, up from the roughly mid-600k range previously, while nearly 650,000 characters have completed Dawntrail's main scenario, as indicated by ownership of the completion mount rewards. That's a very healthy completion rate and suggests many of the returning players aren't simply logging in for a short period, instead making wholehearted efforts to catch up to current patch in preparation for the new content when it comes out in winter. Early access minion ownership now sits at about 680,000 characters, whilst roughly 430k own the Collector's Edition minion. Those numbers continue to provide an interesting glimpse into just how many active players purchased the more expensive editions of Dawntrail. They've risen steadily alongside overall activity. I'm actually a little surprised at just how many players percentage-wise end up purchasing that more expensive version of the game. Final Fantasy XIV has always been in a pretty decent place, even during the doldrums of mid-expansion's quiet period. Whilst player counts dipped significantly in Dawntrail, more so than they have in the last half a decade, and it is fair to say that public opinion shifted somewhat to match that, the game still holds a very strong position as one of the most popular and well-respected MMOs on the market, considering it's one of the few to maintain a monthly sub-cost in a market that wouldn't support it for many of its competitors. But now, it's in what I'd argue is a flat-out good place completely. If we look at this chart of active players, a lot of the time people take these images and use them as an example to doom and gloom about Dawntrail or whatever they've decided they don't like in that moment. But now, the bar is getting larger once more. Players on all spectrums are increasing again, and right now that isn't due to any kind of magical new content that has released, but instead just the announcement of the next expansion and the tonal shift for the next few years of FF14 that will accompany it. I hate to say it bluntly, but you're not getting a large number of returning players from the new update to Occult Crescent. This is a player shift due to Evercold. Of course, that isn't to say there weren't player losses in Dawntrail. There certainly were. Active player numbers still haven't reached the highs seen around Dawntrail's launch or the early expansion honeymoon period. But compared to where the game was at its lowest point earlier in the expansion, the trajectory is clearly positive. Instead of another post-patch decline, we're seeing sustained engagement over multiple census periods, and that's probably the most encouraging result. I don't think Square Enix could have hoped for more heading into the next stage of the expansion. One important thing to bear in mind is that these figures were collected and disseminated before the start of the European Fan Festival. I know I'm covering this a little bit late, it's because I was at the European Fan Festival, and then I made a load of videos about it, and I just haven't had time to get around to this until now, meaning that these numbers do not capture any of the excitement or returning player count generated by the announcements made there. The Final Fantasy VII themed raid series will be the key amongst them, and as far as I'm concerned, will likely be a pretty big ace in the hole for Square Enix to bring in Final Fantasy fans who haven't yet dipped their toes into 14. Would call it a break glass in case of emergency moment, though in this case, I don't think that was true. I instead think it was a patient and calculated move in order to strike at the perfect time, and I hope that pays off. Historically, fanfests, major announcements and limited time events tend to produce more noticeable spikes in activity, particularly amongst lapsed players. That means this census should probably be viewed as a snapshot of the player base before what could be another wave of returning players, making the next Lucky Bancho survey particularly interesting to watch to see whether that momentum continues, and I have a feeling that it will. We'll definitely get to see at least one more survey before Evercold, and that should be after the EU FanFest hype, after Beastmaster has released, and either directly before or directly after the Japanese Fan Festival as well. And if anything, I'm so interested to see where that number winds up as the promotional cycle really well and truly gets underway. I hope we're about to experience a really exciting time to be playing FF14.